Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some die cut wreath cards with texture using the new Texture and Foliage collection from Spellbinders. This here is the Autumn Greetings wreath die set. And then we have the seasonal wreath foliage die, which has a lot of different options. So you can create several different types of wreaths with that. Then we have the birthday wishes sentiments press plate and die set. So there's one press plate in here and one die to create a lot of different sentiments all at once. For added texture to the background, we have a new linen embossing folder. This one would be perfect not only for just a linen background, but I think it would be fun for like baskets and stuff like that as well. To start off, I'm going to create a magicals background. I want my pieces for a couple of my wreaths to have some shimmer to them as well as different colors blending together. So I have two pieces of mixed media cardstock here, or mixed media Heavystock, and I'm using the Autumn Leaves Magicals set. I'm just using the blue and green one on the piece of cardstock on the right, and then I'm using all of the colors on the cardstock on the left. So I'm going to use these to create pieces for two different cards. Now, when I use magicals, I like to use my Mighty Mister and I spritz water all over my glass mat. I do it on both sides of the cardstock and kind of suction my paper down. And I found that by doing that, my paper doesn't curl by being wet on one side. And I get a little bit more control over my blending of my colors because they stay where I put them. When that paper starts to curl, they usually rolls to the end or like drips to the end. So you kind of get lines on them. By doing it this way, it stays pretty flat and I don't have to worry about the paper curling and having my colors pool in one section or running to the edges of the paper. So I mist my cardstock first, then I use a fan brush to lightly dust the different colors over my cardstock, and then I use a different brush to just kind of break up any clumps of that powder. Often you'll get clumps of that powder sitting in that water. Even though I mist more water on afterwards, it doesn't completely dissolve all of that. So I will take a brush and I will just break that up a little bit. When I do that, I do clean my brush between different colors and then I let it dry completely overnight. It takes a long time for it to dry because of the fact that I've suctioned it to my surface. So while it keeps the paper fairly flat, it does take a lot longer to dry. What I'll often do is after that water has absorbed into the cardstock, I'll often lift it up and put some cardstock or some paper towel underneath it, but I do let it dry for a really long time. So I'll often do this step the night before I want to create with it. But I create some really nice papers this way, some really unique papers. So the one that I used all the colors for, I'm using the Autumn Greetings wreath die set, just the leaves from that, and I'm cutting a bunch of leaves. The one that I used just the blue and the green from the set, I'm cutting one of the wreath branches from the seasonal wreath foliage die set. And I love the blues and teals to that one. Now, when I cut the leaves out, I wasn't really paying attention to the edges of my cardstock. Often I love to use these magical backgrounds as mats around my focal point, just to tie it all in and to tie all of the colors in. But when I'm doing it for the wreath piece here, I am paying attention. I have cut this piece down to the final size that I want it. And when I'm doing my die cutting, I'm only doing it out of the center. So when I have my card together, I'll be able to use that as a mat, but you won't even see that there's something cut out of the center. I have some of the gourds and the pumpkins from the Autumn Greetings set, die cut out of carrot cardstock as well as saffron cardstock. And I'm using distress inks in crushed olive, fossilized amber, and rusty hinge just to do a little bit of ink blending around those edges, just to give them a little bit more interest. Once I have that done, I let the ink dry for just a moment and then I start to assemble everything. I have the Autumn Greetings sentiment from this set die cut out of some Merlot Cardstock, and then I use some Acorn Cardstock for the shadow around it. The Acorn Cardstock is also what I use to die cut the wreath pieces, so that will tie in there. And those magical backgrounds that I die cut leaves out of, you can see a lot of the reddy burgundy color, which ties in really well with that Merlot Cardstock. As I'm gluing everything together, I'm using my Barely Art glue. I use this for pretty much everything, and I have it in a fine line bottle so I can use it for little teeny tiny things like these sentiments, as well as larger pieces for assembling my cards. It comes in so handy, and I love using liquid glue because it gives me that little wiggle room in order to move and shimmy things in place. So these gourds and pumpkins are really, really easy to assemble. They have a little stem to them and they all die cut at one time. I have those stems die cut out of some Rainforest Cardstock. I wanted to have a little bit of brightness to the card, but you could always use those magical backgrounds and use the areas that have the greeny or the blue colors if you wanted to tie them in with there. But I wanted my gourds and pumpkins to be a little bit brighter and kind of a bit of a focal point, as well as having my wreath kind of frame them. So for my background for this card, I'm using the Oak Forest embossing folder, perfect for fall cards, and it's just going to add even more texture. This wreath is going to have texture to it anyways because of all the die cuts together, but I always love, even if we're going to do a plain background, just to have embossing there because it just adds an interesting background that's just visually just more interesting than plain cardstock. So my mat for my Magicals piece is going to be 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, but because when I was die cutting my leaves I went fairly close to the edge, I'm going to emboss that piece with that Oak Forest embossing folder, and then I'm cutting that down to 3 7/8 inches by 4 1/8 inch, or sorry, 5 1/8 inches, so that I have just a really thin frame. It's going to still tie everything together, it's still going to frame it, but that way I don't have to worry about exposing some of the pieces that I had die cut a little too close to the edge. Another option here, instead of using the Magicals background that I have left over, would be to use the Merlot cardstock that I used for my sentiment. That would tie in really nicely as well. So as I have my background, my embossed background, my mat on my card base drying, I put an acrylic block on them, and I do this quite often. And then as I'm letting that dry, I will just figure out where I want things placed. Now I have these pieces for the wreath die cut out of that Acorn Cardstock. I want to intermix my magical leaf die cuts among that. So I'm going to create a wreath that is both the leaves as well as the bare sticks. We're going to see a little bit of both. I'm going to use the die cuts for the wreath to frame it first, and then I'm going to start tucking in those leaf die cuts. Now, by using this liquid glue, it gives me some wiggle room. So when I'm gluing this in place, I'm only putting glue down the center of these stick pieces for the wreath because I want to make sure that I'm able to tuck in all those little leaf die cuts. So the liquid glue gives me that wiggle room to do that. If there are any die cuts or pieces that are sticking out that I want glued down once I'm done, I can always use my glue to just put in a little bit of glue here and there to make sure that everything is nice and secure. But I always like to make sure that I have that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place while I'm doing that. Now, before I start inserting my leaves, I'm going to put the pumpkins and the gourds in the center of the wreath, and I want them just kind of nesting in the bottom of that wreath there. And you can see that they're a lot brighter than my leaves as well as my sticks. Again, I wanted that to be a focal point. I wanted it to kind of frame that in there. So once those are where I want them to go, I'm going to add in the different leaves. Now, because my magical background had a bunch of different colors, some of my leaves are going to be darker, some of them are going to be lighter, some of them are going to be more blue, they're going to be more red. So they've got a lot of variety in them. So as I'm placing them, I'm trying to make sure to not put the exact same leaves together. I'm trying to put different colors together just to add a bit of variety and kind of disperse all the different colors around that wreath. But by using that liquid glue and by not completely gluing down those stick pieces, I have that wiggle room. I'm starting on the bottom right where those gourds and pumpkins are. I wanted to make sure that I didn't run out of leaves while filling them in for the rest of the wreath, and I don't. I have plenty. Typically when I do my die cutting, I die cut more than I think I'm going to need. Sometimes I end up using all of them, and sometimes I have leftover pieces. When I do have leftover pieces, I just put them in Ziploc bags, put them right with that die set, so it may get used in a future project. And if I'm doing a future project with that die set, I will have some pieces already made and ready to go that may or may not work for the idea I had intended. But if I'm ever looking for those particular die sets, I just know that that's the first place to look because that's where I will have stored them. So as I'm tucking in my leaves here, I'm making sure to tuck some in the bottom part, some in the center part. So I'm making sure that to keep the shape of my wreath and kind of evenly disperse those leaves as I'm going. While I'm working, I'm also kind of paying attention to what leaves I have left and thinking about where I want to place those so that I don't run out of leaves and then all of a sudden realize I have an open spot. So I'm keep constantly trying to pay attention to what I have done, what open spots I have left, and what leaves and die cuts I have left. The last step here is there's some little curlicue pieces for the vines for the pumpkins. So I'm just going to insert there. I left this to the end because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to put them in an area where I had them covered by leaves. I wanted to make sure that they were visible. So here's our first card, an autumn card that has so much texture between all of those die cuts layered to create the wreath, as well as that embossed background. For my second card, I'm going to be using the seasonal wreath foliage die set. I have holly branches here from this die set, die cut out of Fern Cardstock. I wanted something a little bit darker than the Rainforest Cardstock that I had used for the stems for my leaves and my gourds. Before doing any assembly, I want to do a little bit of ink blending, so I've used some Rustic Wilderness Distress ink on the bottom parts of those branches, of those holly branches. Now you can see there's a couple different sizes of those holly branches. There's one that's a little bit larger and one that's a little bit smaller. And even of the smaller ones, it goes in two directions. So when I first started die cutting, I cut both directions, and then I realized that one wasn't going to work for the wreath that I was going to create. I often, when I'm creating wreaths, I make sure that all of the branches go in the same direction. I just think it looks a little bit better that way. And I've also die cut the berries out of glitter cardstock from the Ruby Treasured cardstock pack. I'm using the Merry Christmas sentiment from this set, and I have the Merry Christmas itself die cut out of that glitter cardstock. It die cuts like a dream. Even though those letters are really nice and fine, there was no problem die cutting that glitter cardstock. And then the shadow for it was die cut out of that Fern cardstock. For my background, I am using that linen embossing folder from this collection, and I have that embossed and then I trim it down. I always do my embossing and then trim down afterwards, just to make sure that if by chance my sizes get skewed, I can make sure to trim it down to the exact size I want once I'm done. So my mat for this card is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. My embossed piece I'm trimming down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So my measurements are different from the last card. I made all three of these different. Usually in a video I will do all the same mats, but this time I did them all different just for something a little bit more a little bit different. I'm going to glue that mat onto the back or the base of the card, and you can see that I die cut my shadow for my Merry Christmas from that mat. This is the way that I do this often to extend my cardstock. If I don't by chance have a small scrap to die cut those pieces out of, I might as well die cut them out of the mat. There's going to be a piece over top of it anyways. You'll never know that anything was die cut out of this. And this is especially helpful when it comes to specialty cardstocks. Those tend to be a little bit more pricey, so it's always nice to find ways to extend that just a little bit. So once I have my base and my embossed piece glued down, for this card I'm going to do the Merry at the top and then the Christmas at the bottom, and I'm going to do my wreath in between that. So I will regularly just kind of lay it out to make sure I have enough room before I start gluing things down. This way I'm aware of how much space my die cuts are going to take, and I can just be more aware of when I'm gluing them down, what angle to put them on, and that sort of thing. So it just makes it a little bit easier rather than gluing down your pieces and then all of a sudden running out of space. Much easier to know how much space you have ahead of time and work with it. So after gluing down my larger holly branches, then I'm tucking in the smaller ones, and these are just going to give a little bit extra texture to them. I had 3 of the large ones die cut and 3 of the small branches die cut, so I don't have double layers for the entire wreath, just parts of it. And that for me was enough. You could always die cut more of the smaller ones if you wanted double layers for all of it. My berries were die cut out of the same Ruby Glitter cardstock as my sentiment, and on the larger branches, there's actually spaces to put those berries, so you can tell exactly where they intend them to go. Those spaces are not put on the smaller branches, so I fill those spaces in first, and then I start to add more berries between those spaces. Now, I have to admit, I missed one when I was filming, so I did add those berries to it at the end. This was a clump that is kind of right under the G or the Y of Mary. There's a space there that they had intended for berries to go, and I just didn't notice it while I was filming. Again, super easy to add that afterwards. I am using a jewel picker to lift up my die cuts and put them into my glue. It just makes it really easy because you can see exactly where you're placing them. Obviously, make sure that the glitter side or the right side is facing up before doing that. And you'll see that as I'm working on them, I do flip them over as I'm working. But by using these glitter berries, it just gives some extra sparkle. It ties in with that sentiment, just gives it some extra texture to it. Other finishes from that ruby cardstock mix would be fantastic as well. There is some mirror cardstock, there is some matte cardstock, there is pearl finish. So any of those finishes would work well, but I always love glitter when it comes to Christmas cards. For my last card, I'm using the second background that I had created, and I'm using one of the branches from the seasonal wreath foliage die set. I used the holly and foliage embossing folder to emboss the background piece for this card. I thought it worked really well with the leaves that I had chosen for the die cuts. My matte from the Magicals background is cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and my embossed piece I trimmed to 3 7/8 by 4 1/8. So I've got a lot of 8s in there, or 5 1/8. So I've got a lot of 8s in there, but I wanted to show as much of that matte as possible. I also wanted to give extra space for my wreath. So once I have those trimmed down, I can glue those to my card base, and you can see that I had die cut those branches out of that center, but we don't even know because we got that embossed piece on top of there. For the sentiments for this, I'm going to be using the Birthday Wishes Sentiments press plate and die set. This is from this collection, and I'm going to be using one of the inks from the new Happy Better Press ink set. This is an ink set from Dina Wakley. I used both of the new sets that have come out. I used them recently in a video, and this tealy color just worked really, really well with the colors from my magical background. So it was a perfect combination. So I inked that Better Press plate, forgot about putting my cardstock on the clear plate, and I'm just using Hammer Mill cardstock, nice and simple. So I inked it, then put the cardstock there, and then inked it again because there's a good chance that my ink had already dried. So definitely a better idea to make sure that your cardstock is taped to your clear plate before inking your plate. Once I had run that through my Platinum 6 machine, I matched up the die set, and I always like to tape my die in place with some Best Ever craft tape just to make sure that it's not going to move on me while I am die cutting. I always do this, and that Best Ever craft tape can be used several times, so it's not a one-use thing. I keep saving it, and once it stops to stick really well, then I will toss it. So by doing this, I have a ton of different sentiments. I'm actually going to use 3 of them on this card. They just really worked really, really well together, and I just love the look of that color ink with this wreath. So just like before, I laid my pieces out, then laid my wreath out. And from the last card, I have an idea of how much space I have, so I don't have to worry about it quite as much. As I'm gluing these down, I'm making sure to put lots of glue on the back, but I'm not pressing them down totally onto my background quite yet. And that's because I want to make sure that I have room to place the other branches underneath. So I will often just place them where I want them to go. Then I will place the die cuts underneath to make sure that I have they haven't adhered to my card base. Once I have them all glued down, then I will put my acrylic block on there just to hold it down nice and flat and make sure that it has good contact. Once I have that wreath done, I can add those sentiments to the top and the bottom. Now, those sentiments could have been glued down before rather than afterwards. It really doesn't make a difference. I knew how much space I had them laying there, so I knew how much space they were going to take. And then before letting that dry too much, I decided to glue the sentiment on the inside of the card so that when I had my acrylic block on there, it was just holding everything down nice and flat and letting everything dry. For the berries for this card, I have them die cut out of the pearl finish cardstock from the Antique White Treasured Cardstock pack. This has just a little bit of beautiful pearl shimmer to them, and that shimmer has a bit of a gold tone to it. So it's just really nice that shimmer with the shimmer from the Magicals background. Now, once I had them glued in place, I didn't really think you could see the shimmer as much as I had wanted. So what I end up doing is adding some glossy accents to them. It gives them that extra dimension, that extra shine, and it just gives them a different texture from the wreath pieces. So just like I did with my glitter pieces, or glitter berries from my last card, I put dots of glue down and then use my jewel picker to pick up those die cuts and place them down. Now, one of my die cuts fell off my jewel picker, so when I went to put it down into the glue, I ended up putting my jewel picker right into the glue, so I got glue at the end of it, which is not a big deal, except for as I was doing the rest of the card, my die cuts wanted to stick to my die pick more than they wanted to stick to the glue. So you'll see that I get to a point where I just use my fingers to just place the die cuts into the glue because I was just tired of fighting that jewel picker. Now, as I'm working on them too, I also make sure to turn my die cuts over. When you do die cutting, you get a nice rounded edge from the die. I always like that to be facing up. I don't want it to be the opposite way where you get that ridge around the edge. So as I'm working with these berries, with these die cuts, I will turn them around to make sure that they're facing the right way before I glue them to the card. I just think it creates a nicer look to it. And because these berries have that rounded edge, again, it just has a nicer finish to it when you do them. So as I'm working, I decided to use up all of the berry die cuts that I have. I wasn't going to have very many left anyways, so I end up using all of them. So there's none left to store, but that was at the point where I decided I wanted to just add a little bit more texture. We have the texture from our embossed background as well as those die cuts, but I really wanted those berries to stand out a little bit more. So just adding a dot of glossy accents to them really does that. This is one of those things that I often like to add to some sort of part of cards because it just gives, I love cards with texture. So by adding that extra little bit of texture, I think it takes it to the next level and it just finishes it off nicer. I do let that dry completely, and here is the finished result. We have that beautiful shimmer from the Magicals background, not only on those branch die cuts, but also on our mat. And then we have the extra texture that the glossy accents has given those berries, and those just take it to the next level. Then we have our Christmas wreath with the holly branches and those glitter berries, as well as the glitter cardstock for the Merry Christmas sentiment. Just screams holiday to it, and that linen background to it doesn't take anything away from the wreath, but it just adds that extra texture. Then our autumn greetings card with those Magicals leaves, as well as our pumpkin and gourds with that oak leaf background. So there's just so much texture in each one of these cards, not only with those embossed backgrounds, but with all the layering of the different die cuts. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.